Good evening, folks. My name is Joseph Berger. I'm the Theater Operations and Events Manager at Film Forum, an independent nonprofit four-screen cinema in Manhattan's West Village. We're now in our 51st year. So I'd love to welcome you all on behalf of the theater. And firstly, thank you to Nicky and Asya and Riverdale Country School for putting this event together. Tonight's discussion is about BILL TRAYLOR Chasing Ghosts, directed by Jeffrey Wolfe, which most of you have seen by now. Film Forum was proud to present this film at our theater for in-person theatrical screenings the past 2 weeks. And the film continues to run on our virtual cinema platform. I encourage all of you to visit our website, filmforum.org, and check out our dynamic selection of premieres, including documentaries, world cinema, and American independence, as well as restored classics. And I would love to welcome now the Deputy Director of Film Forum, Sonia Chung. Hi, Sonia.
Hi, thanks, Joe. Hello, everybody. Welcome. Thank you for joining us on this Friday evening. We're delighted to be collaborating tonight with all of the people you see on the screen. Jeffrey and Radcliffe, we're so glad to have you. And working with Asya and Nicky and Riverdale Country School has been such a delight. I'm going to let Jeffrey reveal to you how this collaboration actually first came to be, what the connection is. But I just wanted to say that we, Film Forum, we're, as everyone, we are very glad to kind of put the last 14, 15 months or so behind us when we were closed and struggling through everything that everyone in the world has been struggling through. But one of the lemonade that we were able to make out of some of those lemons is that because we've been closed, we have not been able to show our films on screen. We, like a lot of organizations, pivoted to virtual. And because of that, we've been able to bring our programming to places that previously we weren't able to bring it to. And schools and school partnerships is one of those. And that's been really exciting for us because so many of our films, as some of you may know, do have this, I'm also an educator, have this really deep, incredible educational, pedagogical value. This film in particular, it's about art, it's about history, it's about society and race and justice and all the things that I think as educators we're all trying to engage young people in thinking about and talking about. The film has also wonderful kind of multidisciplinary performance, and it's just a terrific way to connect with you all out there. So we're really, really happy about that. So I will hand it over and welcome now Nicky and Asya, who you all know very well, I think, require no introduction, but who are, of course, both themselves working artists, which is wonderful, and of course, educators in your community. So Nicky and Asya are moderators.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia. Thank you, Joe. See you on the flip side. And thank you, everyone who made it tonight. We really appreciate that. We don't take it for granted. It's a Friday night in a pandemic, and here we are. So thank you so much for coming, and thank you to Film Forum, and thank you to our distinguished panelists on behalf of the entire art department.
Radcliffe Bailey, who all of you have seen in the film, he's the subject of the film, is a painter, a sculptor, and a mixed media artist who explores themes of ancestry, race, and memory. Radcliffe believes that by translating his personal experiences, he can achieve an understanding of and healing from a universal history. Radcliffe was born in New Jersey in 1968 and grew up in Atlanta, where he's zooming in from, I believe, where he currently lives and works. Radcliffe received a BFA in 1991 from the Atlanta College of Art and has since exhibited work at many institutions like High Museum of Art in Atlanta, the McNay Art Museum in San Antonio, the Miami Art Museum, MoMA PS1 in New York City. Radcliffe's work is in the collections of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Smithsonian Museum of American Art, the Museum of Fine Arts Houston, and many more. Jack Shainman Gallery has represented Radcliffe since 2002. Radcliffe, we're really happy to have you. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
And Jeffrey Wolfe is no stranger to Riverdale. He's the filmmaker of tonight's film. This is Jeffrey's second feature-length documentary. Previously, Jeffrey made the award-winning James Castle Portrait of an Artist, a film that delves into the life and creative process of James Castle as told by family, artists, and members of the deaf community. Jeffrey has also made short films about the artists James Sunford Thomas, Martin Ramirez, Elijah Pierce, and his articles, art reviews, and photographs have appeared in numerous publications. He's also a film editor who has worked with Arthur Penn, Sidney Lumet, and John Waters. Jeffrey, how are you?
Hi, how you doing?
So now Sonia and I are gonna leave it to Asya and Nicky, and we will see you in about 50 minutes.
Thank
Great.
you so much.
Thank
Go ahead,
you.
Asya.
Let me start since the Riverdale
Okay,
connection
good.
came up, only that both of Jeannie and my children went to Riverdale, class of, I think, 1997 and class of 2000. So we have an intimate relationship with that community, and really happy to share this evening with it.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, for attending, and thank you, Riverdale families, for being here on a Friday night and for, helping this happen. I'll start it off with questions. So, Jeffrey, is there a specific visual aesthetic or style in Bill Traylor's artwork that affected, changed, or transformed your approach to presenting the information, story, and imagery of your film?
Wow. Well, here, I've been interested in this kind of work for quite a while. I first saw Bill Traylor's work in 1982, I think, and kind of fell in love with it. And it had this kind of quality. It may look simple on first glance, but it had this quality that I wouldn't say haunted me, but stayed with me for a very, very long time. But I knew to tell his story, you had to kind of delve into the history behind where he came from. And so that was really the big challenge in the film, was to be able to find a structure that a story like this could be told in. I would say that the work itself started to jump off the page and kind of direct us where to go. If we, you look at an image with so much movement in it, it kind of brought you to dancers. If you looked at the color blue, it made you research, which Radcliffe talks so eloquently about in the film, and Willie King sings about, like what the color blue can mean in so many different circumstances. When you look at the kind of silhouette versions of his figures, you try to imagine what real people may look like, and how to take those simple forms and turn them into people. So all those layers were like peeling an onion, and finding a way of telling that story. And that's why, again, we have narrators, we have performers, just trying to delve into all those little nooks and crannies. Never was there anyone who said so many big things in such a small space as Bill Traylor. I mean, he finds, like, he uses the canvas being found materials often in a way that no one else really did it at the time. And it's also the fact that the work got saved even is sort of a phenomenon, given that he was pretty much homeless for most of the later part of his life when he was doing the work.
Yeah, that really speaks to the power of the work. So Radcliffe, Bill Traylor clearly really affected your work, and I'm interested in how specifically was it the imagery, the whole motivation behind it, like what, if you could name it, what was the effect on your work that he had?
Well, my first encounters with Bill Traylor's work was at the High Museum in Atlanta, and I went to Atlanta College of Art. Atlanta College of Art was one of those schools that was connected to a museum, and so the whole Woodruff Art Center, which it's called in Atlanta, which has the museum, has a school of art, has a symphony, and they were all connected. And so as a student, I would often visit the museum, and in the museum they had Bill Traylor's work. But also before being a student at the Atlanta College of Art, my mother took me to the museum, and I remember encountering his work on the walls in the museum. But I would also see his work, but it would also be very close to African art, just because the juxtaposition between the self-taught and those African artists. And I was always puzzled by his work, but I just remember seeing certain works in the museum with this kind of blue. And I just remember seeing these figures kind of, just as Jeffrey explained it, kind of moving throughout this small space. And it was beautiful. But as a young artist, growing up in America, African-American artist, and not necessarily knowing my makeup, my DNA, before this whole entire thing about tracing our DNA, I was always curious about, where do I dig from? Do I dig from art history as told in a certain way, which me and my friends, we often refer to as art mystery, because there's never, ever anything that's really, truly true, because you're really it's coming from one perspective. So it's not necessarily telling the story of the world and all the different people around the world at the same time. It's really kind of, I don't know, it's just being picked a particular way. So for me, Bill Traylor's work was more like that first taste of trying to understand DNA. And around the same time, I remember there were shows that were coming to the museum, which were like Art of the Yoruba. I remember seeing that work, but I also remember seeing that work and seeing these actual Yoruba sculptures using this same color blue. So there was always questions about, like, is this intentional what Bill Traylor's doing? What is this? Where is this from? But his work always reminds me of a certain rhythm, of a certain kind of music that you may hear from some other place, and you may not necessarily understand the words, but you understand the rhythm of it. And his work, for me, was more pretty much like the glue, in terms of trying to figure out my own makeup. So that was one of my first encounters.
Yeah, one thing that Radcliffe just said that I think is interesting in relationship to somebody like a Bill Traylor is that he just kind of went through kind of his arc in this, and with somebody like Bill Traylor, who we didn't get to speak to, if you're Black and poor and indigent, records weren't kept very well. There was no audio recordings of him. There's very few photographs. So like all that ancestry and history and memory, what was the transcendent moment where he like put that all together? That's one thing we could never, we'll never find out, but it's one of the greatest mysteries of this whole story is like, how did it happen? So it's interesting to hear Radcliffe talk about the different steps. And I mean, even to the effect where Charles Shannon, who is one of the people who discovered Bill Traylor, he eventually gave a big quantity of Traylor's work to the High Museum, which is what allowed Radcliffe to have that experience in the first place. So it's a very, it's a very layered story in many ways.
Can I jump in with a question? I think it's a good segue to a question about championing the art, right? And Charles Shannon was this white artist who obviously saw the value of Bill Traylor's art in this way that Asya and I were talking about earlier, of like being an artist's artist. Bill Traylor was someone who was his power, his talent was recognized by fellow artists more than anyone at that time. Mm-hmm. And so it brings up this interesting question about discovering artists, right? In the movie, Charles Shannon says, I was the one who discovered Bill Traylor, right? And so there's this kind of almost ownership kind of quality to it, and then which brings up the idea of cultural appropriation and stuff. But on the other hand of that is this idea of just people championing artists who need champions, like Bill Traylor needs people to dust the stuff off and put it in the Smithsonian. And so and to me it's very, very interesting to think that this is not a Black movie by a Black filmmaker presenting this Black artist in this like niche mindset of like, this is for Black people, this is a Black art form, and etc. Right? So the question for you, Jeffrey, would be, and I'd like to hear your thoughts about this too, Radcliffe, it would be, what is it that really made you kind of see yourself in Bill Traylor, to embrace him and to decide to champion him to such a degree, which is a phenomenal degree?
Yeah, well, I would answer that with in two kind of layers. Probably the most important thing is you have to, when I had done a movie down in Mississippi years before, even knowing about that I was interested in self-taught art, and it kind of, being down south kind of changed my opinion about the South a lot, and that it was a much more complicated place and that it appeared, especially to us who live in the North. And so I think, like when you were talking about somebody like a Charles Shannon, there's words that get put, like a white savior kind of thing, but you have to think about the time periods that this happened in, where a Black person sitting on a street corner in Montgomery had to show racial etiquette. He had to, there's certain things that he may have been drawing that he could have been, killed for. It wasn't without any danger at all. So you have to think about that first, I think. Second, it is funny, like there are several people who take credit to having discovered him. I think I talk about three, there's probably more. And considering that he died in 1949 and he wasn't really discovered until the Black Folk Art Show at the Corcoran Museum in the early 80s, it took a lot of time. But as a white filmmaker, I would say, I wanted to somehow restore interest in his work and bequeath the justice and acclaim that I felt that he deserved during his lifetime, number one. This is what Leslie Emberger did at the Smithsonian, and what I'm doing with the movie is kind of the first word about Bill Traylor. It doesn't have to be the last word. I mean, we're hoping to open up a Bill Traylor Study Center at Alabama State University, which would allow them, through the archives that we've all collected, would allow students to get into the work much deeper. So it's that we're telling a story, we're not telling the story. So, I hand it over to whoever wants to pick up the gauntlet and go from there. But I felt like if I didn't do it, this history was fading away and fading away and fading away, and I felt this was the time to get it out there.
And we are so thankful that you did. And Radcliffe, what do you think about this? The intricate, multi-layered notions of it's kind of almost like allyship, people standing up for people who identify differently from themselves or something like that.
You're right. Well, when I think about his work, I think that sometimes we can look at it as the patron chose Bill Traylor, but I think it's the other way around. I think Bill Traylor's work has a way in which it just touches people and it does its own thing. And it transcends and it goes beyond what we think of. It's beyond the value of it. It's beyond the value in terms of it's money, it's value. That value goes beyond that. I think Bill Traylor's work lives and it's in a particular place. It's like particular individuals who've changed the world. I think that Bill Traylor's work does that. And I think his influence I know plenty of artists that are my contemporaries who've been influenced by Bill Traylor. Whether or not they mention it, whether or not they talk about it. Sometimes there are artists that they don't necessarily draw the connections because they may not necessarily think his work is that sophisticated. I believe that Bill Traylor's work influences everyone from all different angles. And I think that I really look at the artist as more like, I want to use these words like trickster, or the work has a way in which it just is still weaving and doing its own thing. It's almost like the African practices in West Africa. They're still being practiced. They have crossed the Atlantic, and they've turned and took on different shapes and forms. And it's almost like those practices have taken another twist. I would almost draw Bill Traylor's work in a strange way to hip hop music. I would say that because in terms of the sounds, the riffs, the periods, speaking in certain periods, and then also the obvious connections to the blues. And, you know, they're singing for a lack of love and searching for some type of deity. When I think about his work, I feel like this yearning to talk about a history, just as the same way as someone like Jacob Lawrence and deals with the migration and has a certain purpose, and it does a certain body of work that's based on this. I think Bill Traylor's work naturally does that, and it does it in a certain way. And it's very, I don't know, maybe I'm getting lost in it a little bit, but but that's what his work does. It leaves you in a space where you don't have all the answers, and there's always going to be more and more questions about his work.
You know, as a filmmaker and editor, I'll take part of what Radcliffe said in the sense that what makes art great, or any literature, is a universality in some way, and the work that Traylor did in 1940 is as present now and relevant now as it was then, and I think will continue to be. I don't think there's sort of a time window on what he's, you know, trying to say and the story he's trying to tell, and you know, and I think that that's an important point too, is that these aren't just individual images that he's putting out there. It's a narrative. I mean, he's telling a story, and that story is you know, like, it may go back 400 years, it may not, you know, but there's a lot of things that he learned in that lifetime that come out in the work. So you know, what's that expression, when a grandparent dies, it's like a library burns down, you know? I mean, he's a library of information.
Right.
I'm actually going to ask a question that Nicky and I had been talking about his work, and about Bill Traylor's work being more, you know, installation than it was just imagery, like more multimedia than it's perceived. Can you speak to the connection between his work and African art and hoodoo, both of you? And how would he have encountered those art forms? Like, if there is a direct correlation, like Radcliffe, you were saying that his work, when it was presented near the African art, and there's like a clear correlation or resemblance in some way. How would he have gotten that? Or like, do you have a theory or an idea as to why these correlations are manifested in his work?
You, Jeffrey?
Well, I would strongly, before Radcliffe answers that, I would strongly recommend you Google Radcliffe's work, because, I mean, look a little bit behind you, behind Radcliffe sitting there. You can kind of get a sense of how Radcliffe takes this material from all these different cultural parts of his life and forms them together into concepts that, you know, I think is what you're taking something that's two-dimensional of Bill Traylor, and you're three-dimensionalizing it, which is kind of an interesting concept in its own right. I think, you know, the film tries to do that by some of the methods that I mentioned earlier, by kind of taking it off the page a little bit. But Radcliffe actually, you know, I see your snake behind you there.
It's a reference to Bill Traylor, but there's also a lantern on the back, a lamp, that references Bill Traylor too. But, you know, when I think about it, you know, I wish I knew Bill Traylor's DNA. I wish I could, you know, say, hey, he was connected to, but, you know, there's things that we can draw, you know, references to West Africa, just thinking about the numbers of Africans who crossed the Atlantic that end up going through the Carolinas and around the coast. But then we can also go around to areas like Haiti, and then we can all, come around through all the different islands, and then that travel path. But then also what I think about is, like, often a lot of those enslaved Africans had those beliefs and practices which they kept close to themselves, and they didn't necessarily reveal them because they were, seen as being dangerous. You can go to the Congo and you can trace certain objects and things that were made during the time of people being enslaved. So when I think about his work, I think about it's almost like a secret language. And I feel like there's a mixture of a makeup of different types of people from West Africa. And it's not necessarily one group, but I think it's several groups. And I think his work carries that, and it comes together in an interesting way. You can look at some metal work that's being done in Haiti, and you can see figurative figures coming throughout the work that you can trace to Bill Traylour. But often in the United States, we don't necessarily acknowledge the African presence. We acknowledge the people, but we think of it as everything's been taken from them, and so all they have is what's been given to them. But what I know and what I've gathered, and through just looking at my own family and looking at my grandmother, and after a while I traced my DNA and I traced it to Sierra Leone and Guinea, and then in Sierra Leone and amongst the Mende, the women controlled the society. Within my own family, my mother's sister, my grandmother, they controlled everything. And it's similar practices in similar ways. And I don't necessarily think it's not something that's passed down by taught or told. I think it's a part of people's makeup. And I believe in a Black aesthetic. I believe in it. It's different. It's very complicated, and we have to go through our history and deal with the politics of the things that were happening through different time periods. But I believe in a certain aesthetic, and I think that when I look at his work, I see something that's old and something that was preserved by himself and preserved by those that were around him enough that I didn't know who his friends were. I didn't know who his friends were when he was a kid. I didn't know, information that his parents or grandparents or family members passed on information, but I believe that there was information that was passed on. I remember going to, not too long ago, past 5 or 6 years ago, and I went to a plantation off of the coast of Georgia on Cumberland Island. I remember going to this one plantation. I remember seeing these chimneys that were stacked, and these were the chimneys, the houses where the enslaved Africans were. And I remember seeing this fireplace, and the fireplaces were there, but right above one fireplace, there was a conch shell. And I remember seeing that conch shell, and for me, it spoke of those that lived in that space, their spirituality. And so when I think about Bill Traylour's work, I think about it in the same way. I think about his work just like I think about a lot of self-taught artists. But yeah, if I answered the question.
Yeah, I do want to address something that as part of what you asked, that you called hoodoo, which, I think hoodoo is something that did come up from the South and through Haiti. But what I address a little bit more, which is why I brought Greg Tate into the film, is what I call conjure culture. And we all have heard about conjuring and all the imagery and the African folk tales and making a way out of no way. Radcliffe was talking about the trickster, and but one of the conversations, one of the many conversations about Bill Traylour was whether he was a conjurer as opposed to somebody who came from a culture of conjure. And there was a writer who talked about the little bottles being potions rather than alcohol or whatever. So we delve pretty deep into that because there are images that are not explainable in this work, in this body of work. And you know, so part of what Radcliffe is talking about too is that, you know, we can't explain all these things, but we know that culture existed, and we know that the part of the country he lived in had a kind of, you know, southern writing has this magical realism aspect to it anyway. So that if you take all those things and you put them together, you know, that's kind of what makes him. But on the other hand, the other thing that I want to talk about is Greg talked about him as a man, that we treat him as a man in full. And what that means is, to me, is that we don't, you know, we try to give his full history, not just the shiny parts, not just the, you know, the part where he, you know, where he becomes an artist or however that happened. But, you know, he had a lot of wives, he had a lot of children, he got into trouble. You know, he experienced a lot of pain in his lifetime. And, you know, I mean, Radcliffe has a great line that the art is the pill for the pain, which, you know, is going to be the name of my next movie. No, it's a great title, but anyway, you get. I mean, the picture is that, you know, that all this history, a lot of it, you know, you have to dig so much deeper now to find it, because so much of it was obliterated. You look at a town like Montgomery, Alabama. It was a thriving city in 1941. It continued to be. I just saw a photograph today in 1953. It was still kind of thriving. And then, you know, then somebody in their heads decided to obliterate it. I mean, it's literally became a ghost town. When I went there the first time to look at the spots, because I had a map of where BILL TRAYLOR had lived in shacks and, you know, like 3 or 4 different places where he lived and where he sat on corners. They were all parking garages. I mean, there were no bloody people there. There were just parking garages.
Wow.
And, you know, so, you know, I call that an absence of ruin. If you don't have a place to point to talk about a history, then it's very hard to reestablish that history. And the same thing with images. Kerry James Marshall had an expression called the vacuum of images. If you don't have those family photographs in the blanket chest or you know, stuck in the attic somewhere, you can't tell your full story. And, you know, it's funny, the African American community, I didn't, maybe Radcliffe knows a little bit more about it, but many African Americans I know rely on DNA to find that history out. You know, like my parents came from Europe. I have no interest in finding out what their DNA, what their DNA is. So it's, you know, there's something going on that that you can't, you know, America's tamped down on this for so long. We can't keep tamping down on it.
All right.
That brings me to a question about his New York show, which was, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Jeffrey, but I believe it was right here in Riverdale at Ethical Culture Fieldston School.
Yes.
I figured this out just looking on my own, which is a testament to your movie, that it actually gives me so much information that it also sends me on a hunt for more. It makes me hungry for more. So I believe it was 1942 at Ethical Culture Fieldston School, and it was called, the title of the show was BILL TRAYLOR, American Primitive, parentheses, what is it? Works of an Old Negro, end parentheses, right? And so it's like this, you know, that's this historical lens that, you know, it's just hard to wrap your head around.
Yeah.
With the contemporary sensibility. Leslie Umberger says we shouldn't overlay, I forget how she says it, but she says it really well. Like, we shouldn't overlay our contemporary sensibilities onto history while we learn it.
She says it particularly when we're talking about women,
right,
in the movie, but she means it all the way around it. And I kind of referenced that earlier. You know, this does turn you into an archaeologist, as you may have noticed. I mean, you do tend to go deeper and deeper into Google and stuff. But actually, the story of the Fieldston School, it only came about because Alfred Barr, who was the director of the Museum of Modern Art, was started to get interested in this kind of material. And the guy who, I can't remember his name right now, but the person who organized the show at Fieldston worked at MoMA. Mm-hmm. And so that kind of, he made that connection. But what's interesting, I think, is William Edmondson, who's a stone carver, who was a gravestone carver in Nashville, Tennessee. The MoMA did a show of his in 1939. It was the first show of kind of a naive art. Even then, I mean, MoMA used naive; they used primitive, but that started a kind of a wave. Even in the Newark Museum was involved very early as well. Some of the artists from the Harlem Renaissance were influential in how all that kind of came about as well. But Barr actually took heat for it and ended up, sort of being reduced in position, where they knew they needed him as a curator, but they kind of gave him an office in the basement and somebody else took over the museum. But that was, I think that show was the last show until the Corcoran show in 1982. So,
Did you say it was 1939?
I think it was 1940. If I'm not, either 1940 or 1941. I don't remember exactly, because the show at the New South, which was an organization that only existed for 1 year, that Charles Shannon put together with a few other like-minded, social justice people. At the time, being a social justice person in Alabama, you were called a communist, I guess. So they did a show of his work, just taping it onto the wall. And, it wasn't intended to be like a sale. I think it was intended to be an exhibition. They didn't sell anything. But it is interesting to study that work, because from when he was kind of discovered in 1939 to when that show was in 1940, there's quite a progression. It's not just simple animals. It's, what we call exciting events. I mean, there's a lot of things happening in the work. So, if in fact he worked for 3 years or 4 years and he made 1,000 to 1,500 pieces, that means he was doing 3 a day,
right,
every day.
Like the Bob Dylan of the Woody Guthrie of.
Yeah, but that's right, Bob Dylan. Well, when you say Bob Dylan, what I think about is like when he was sort of an average folk singer, and then he went back to Minneapolis or Duluth or wherever he was from in northern Minnesota, and he comes back to New York a year later, and all of a sudden he's writing like hit songs. Right. Who knows?
So I think we have some questions in the chat. Let's see. Okay. Jeffrey and Radcliffe, thank you for such a stunning documentary introducing me to the Mr. Traylor's art. Jeffrey, how did you arrive at the rhythm/pace of visually telling Bill Traylor's story?
Right. I think the work dictated the editing. I mean, that was clear that you couldn't it couldn't be static. It had to be, it had to have movement. And I am an editor by trade, but when I do these films, I tend to hire editors, and Keith Reamer, who's the editor on this film, brought some of these ideas to the table, and I went with them in a lot of ways, and particularly like that one move where in the beginning with the figure, kind of a stick figure with blue on it. When I saw him kind of play around with the movement of that, I really liked it and was taken by it. And also, yes, there's some talking heads, but there's only like 5 or 6 talking heads of experts, because I wanted you to get to know those people. I didn't want like one idea from one person and then move on. I wanted to keep coming back, because I think that the people in the movie found the rhythm of their own as well, and they built on what they said each time. Particularly Radcliffe, because Radcliffe has such a poetic way of describing things, and when I worked with the writer, I think poetry was an important factor here, that we wanted it to be kind of you know, an essay rather than a film. You know, we just wanted it to kind of take off, find its own place.
And it is very poetic. Your movie is a work of art in and of itself. It's not just about an artist. It's a work of art. So
Thank you. And this is my chance to plug Film Forum. Is that Film Forum is, you know, was a place that a film like this isn't easy to find a window to be shown theatrically in. And, you know, they had a long history of showing art films. And when I showed it to them, I had no idea what the response would be. And like within a week, the director of Film Forum, Karen Cooper, wrote me back saying, "We'd like to give you a 2-week run at the Film Forum." I mean, that was like winning Sundance or you know, getting the Golden Ring. So we were very happy to have that affiliation and association.
Clearly, he worked his whole life. He seems compelled to create. Can you talk a little about his sense of himself? Did he define himself as an artist? Do we even know how he thought of himself? From the movie, he was a farmer for most of his life. Did he pursue or accept interest in his work from the art community?
Well, I definitely think I can answer the second part of that. I think we even say it in the movie, is that when he saw his art up on the wall in the New South, he didn't know quite what to do with it. I mean, I think he saw it a little bit as commerce. You know, I mean, he was selling pencils on the street as well. So if somebody came along and paid him a quarter or 50 cents for a drawing, he was happy to get it, I'm sure. And he did, you know, he did have images that he I wouldn't say repeated, but did a similar thing, because you did feel that he knew the animals that he was drawing. So particularly like the cats and dogs, because when they repeat themselves, he doesn't do the exact same thing. He kind of does it from a little different personality point of view. I mean, even as simple as a rabbit, you know, 2 images of a rabbit. One of them, the eye will be in the, you know, the pupil will be right in the center, and the other, it'll be like pushed forward a little bit. And that the one that's in the center looks scared, and the one with it in the front looks like he's on the move. So, so I think he understood what that was. He also, the work is very geometric. We don't go into it much in the film, but he was probably did some surveying work on the plantation that he was on. So he probably learned how to, you know, how to create some sort of geometrics in order to start. So the way we would use, or, you know, a figurative artist may use an animated, what are those called? You know, like a figure that you can bend into different positions. He he would create a geometric shape and kind of work around that. So, and what else is in that question? I don't know. Radcliffe, can you have any idea about how somebody, you know, who you don't know, what his sense of himself could be? You've talked about, Radcliffe has talked about, like, the, you know, like the pill and the pain, and also just about what being self-taught. He says something in the movie that's kind of brilliant, I think, about, you know, I'll let you carry on. You know what I'm talking about? Well, you talk about not being self-taught, but knowing self.
Right.
You know, that there's a confidence in the work. I mean, that's the only kind of personality trait I can sort of ascribe, I think, is the willing to look. You know, some people willing to look at a blank canvas, but in some way he doesn't really look at a blank canvas when you think about it. Is that, you know, an artist named Terry Winter once said to me, "All painting starts in the middle." Well, you know, and I think what he meant by it, now I'd like to hear Radcliffe talk about this, is that he said even like, you know, like an artist that may do something abstract, they may do a figurative drawing first and then paint on top of it, because they want to have, Pollock was the example he used, in fact, that they just needed a place to start. So what Bill Traylor had was like a scar in the paper, or a staple, or discoloring, or, you know, an edge that he could point toward. So you know, that could be his way of overcoming the great challenge of facing a blank slate.
Right. I know. I mean, for myself recently, in terms of looking at Bill Traylor's work, I've been looking at the drawings within the figures and trying to understand that mark making within those marks. Um, and it's fascinating. Well, it's interesting. When I think about myself having my work put on a gallery's wall for the first time, you feel a little exposed. You feel very insecure. You almost want to walk away from it. You don't necessarily want to stand by it. You almost want to like step away. And I think that as an artist making work today, I'm more interested in the journey as opposed to the actual object that's been made. And so when I think about his work too, I almost think of him as this journey, but not necessarily about it being on the wall. So it's almost like I don't think that his intents were, I'm making these things because they're going to be on the wall. I think he's making these things out of survival. There's a necessity. There's this thing. There may have been those, I see those pictures of his kids standing by him when he's drawing. And I think about that. That seems to be the very sacred space where he tends to, I'm taking an assumption because I don't know him, but he seems to be in a very giving space as opposed to making work and it goes on the wall. So I think that there's a part of it when I look at his work and I see it on the wall, it's beautiful and it speaks to me. But I don't necessarily know if he could foresee where his work would be. But it also draws me back to my thoughts about he wasn't discovered as much as he discovered. And he discovered who he was going to channel his things through. And I think that as discovering who he channeled through, his work also just has its own life on its own that goes beyond his time on this planet. I feel like, it's an extension and it's being done in such a way to give. And when I think about the film, and I wish that as a student I had access to a film about Bill Traylor. Now, I think about him influence on a lot of artists, but I can only imagine those that he will influence in generations from now. I remember going to, I went to the Montgomery Museum. And I went to the Montgomery Museum about, I can't remember, it was when a Basquiat show was up. And the Basquiat show was up, and me and a friend, we knew that the Basquiat show was up, and we decided we were going to take a road trip. We took a road trip. We showed up at the museum. No one was in the museum. We had the museum to ourselves. There was plenty of works. And I think it was the first major show that traveled from the Whitney. And I remember seeing the show, but I also remember at that time in the show with my friend, and we're just looking around and looking at work. And then all of a sudden there's a school bus that comes up and it's nothing but these children. And that was just the most enjoyable moment, was to see these children take in the work. These children who don't go to museums to see themselves in a way, or to understand the mark making a little probably better than a scholar. And so when I think about Bill Traylor's work, that's that moment for me too. It reminds me of that moment of young people discovering.
Totally. And that's brilliant that you say that, because that's what we're doing here. We showed this film to 210 students this week at Riverdale Country School. And it felt really great to me, because it felt like we're doing our small part in this kind of like correcting the omission of Bill Traylor, inserting or reinserting, or giving him the place that he deserved all along of a place in American history and specifically art history, you know, and in a way thinking of like history as one definition of history being like what is taught students in school, what are students shown, what do they see in the museum when they're taken to the museum as history. So, you know, this movie has helped to
well, you know, one of the things I think you're talking about too, Nicky, is the canon, you know, of 20th century art is that, you know, not only African Americans, but women too, you know, were left out of that canon in a big way. And it's only recent that some of these outsiders, self-taught, however, you know, whatever word you want to use, are being kind of they're figuring out a place for them. I highly recommend, there's a show in New York for the audience at the New Museum called Grief and Grievance, The Mourning in America, MOURNING. And it's one of the most powerful shows I've seen in a very long time. And it's a good follow-up to what this discussion is about, I think. And yeah,
I wish we could take our students, but you know, this year there are no trips.
No, I know. Yeah, but some of the images probably exist online as well, you know, virtual. But
we'll look into that, and I encourage all the students to, you know, look into Radcliffe Bailey's work, which you can see just from the little snippet of what you're seeing behind him. You can see it's a very interesting, visually forceful kind of work, and also clearly related to Bill Traylor's aesthetic, you know.
Also to pitch for Radcliffe for being willing to come on tonight. In November, there's a one-man show at both New York galleries of Jack Sheeman of Radcliffe's work. So hopefully the virus will be lessened enough that people can go visit that.
You said October?
November.
November.
Nicky, do you want to read one of the last questions? Another question?
Do we have any more? Yeah, sure. Earlier in the webinar, you mentioned Jacob Lawrence. We looked at Lawrence's work in one of my classes and discussed the meaning of the sense of movement in many of his pieces. Do you think there's an overall meaning behind the sense of movement in Bill Traylor's work?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
Do you think there's an overall meaning behind the sense of movement? Yeah, what would you say the meaning behind the sense of movement is?
That's it. That's a harder question to answer. That might take longer.
You tried to get away.
I guess that's people, Great Migration, moving from the south to the north. I think of
people in motion.
People in motion. Slavery, freedom.
If you stand still, shit happens, you know.
Right.
Okay. Sure. Asya, you want to go for the last question? We got 5 minutes.
Yeah, well, there's another question that came in from the chat from Sonia for Radcliffe specifically. As a working artist who's been inspired by Traylor, who began making art so late in his life, what would you say to students who want to develop as artists in terms of pacing and how to become an artist?
Okay. How to become an artist. All right, let me see if I could do this one. I never knew I wanted to be an artist just from my own personal experience. And a lot of it was based around my mother. My mother was a school teacher and she led me into the arts and she took me to museums. I was exposed to different individuals, whenever artists would come in town. I think some of the first artists I met were like Jacob Lawrence. I got a chance to meet James Vanderzee at one time. And then, there were just different people. And those experiences very profound to me. And I would have never, ever, ever had an opportunity to take in Bill Traylor's work if it wasn't for that experience. So I don't know if I answered the question, but I enjoy what I do. It gives me a certain sense of freedom, as you guys know. You guys get in the studio. Studio is a place where you can really answer a lot of questions and you can really ask a lot of questions.
There's a certain amount of bravery that goes along with it. as well.
Yeah.
And if somebody asks a question about books, I would highly recommend Between Worlds: The Art of BILL TRAYLOR from the Smithsonian. I would say that's the tome. And then, oh, there you go. Yeah, it's big. And then if you Google him, you'll see a lot. There's 4 or 5 other books, including a children's book that is worth taking a look at. So
Excellent.
Well, I think-
Radcliffe. Oh,
yeah.
sorry, Nicky, go ahead.
I was just going to say, it seems like we have perfect timing, and we have answered all your questions, and we basically, we have no questions left. So, thank you, everyone, and back to you, Sonia.
It feels like we could keep talking forever, but we did want to
Absolutely.
respect people's time. That was amazing. That was wonderful. Thank you all. It feels so good to have this community here. Radcliffe, thanks for that answer. Yes, you answered the question. And one thing I wanted to say that I love about this event, about this film, as a maker myself and also as a programmer at Film Forum, I think we often in this country and in this culture, we fall into this binary between art and activism and art and justice. And I think, Jeffrey, when we first started talking about this film and how we wanted to sort of do outreach and who we wanted to get the film to and how we wanted to bring it into the world, I think you were in some way struggling with that binary a little bit about sort of, it's an art film, it's also a history film, it's also a justice film. And what I love about being with all of you, working artists, Radcliffe, when you talk about BILL TRAYLOR's art as a journey and as survival, and the pill for the pain and all of that. This is where I think the identity of the artist is actually relevant, right? If art is the process and art is the journey and art is survival, that reality, that energy cannot be ignored. And it's a false binary about what this art is about. And I think that's really meaningful. And the work that we show at Film Forum, I think we're always in that space too, where that binary is being collapsed. So it's wonderful to be here. I hope that everyone who saw the film and who's tuned in right now is also having that feel good collapse of that false separation. So thank you all. This was such a pleasure.
thank you, you guys.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone, and especially you guys. Fabulous film, really.
Thanks. I'll send you a link to my other film. They can show it to your class too.
Sounds
Yes,
good.
please.
Sounds great.
I love that.
Yeah.
All right.
Thank you all very,
Is that
very
the
much.
one about James Castle, you mean?
Yes,
That
about James Castle.
Yeah.
one? Oh, we do a James Castle inspired project in my class, so I would love that.
Perfect.
There is a show that we were trying to develop called Castle in the Classroom. I'll send you a link to that as well.
Thank you. That'd be amazing.
Cool.
Well, thank you all. And again, thanks to everyone at Riverdale and everyone watching this evening. We also need to thank everyone at Kino Lorber, the distributor of BILL TRAYLOR Chasing Ghosts, especially Nick Kemp and Valerie Torres. And Sonia and I would love to thank our staff here at Film Forum who've helped put this together, including Adam Walker and Mike Majori. And I would love to welcome all of you to stay connected to Film Forum through our email newsletter and our social media handle, Film Forum NYC, which is on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube. We will constantly keep you up to date with additions to our theatrical screenings here on West Houston, our virtual cinema roster online, and any upcoming virtual events like this incredible one this evening. So thanks again for being with us. Thank you, Riverdale Country School, and everyone on our panel.
All right.
Bye.
Thank
Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Shout out to Milton Sip.
Yes.
Everyone.